The cinema world was stunned in 1962 when Randolph Scott, promoting what would become his final film, Ride the High Country, granted a rare in-depth interview to Photoplay magazine. What began as a standard career retrospective took an unexpected turn when the interviewer asked about his former co-stars. The timing was significant. Scott, now 64, was starring in a film that many critics would later recognize as an elegiac farewell to the Western genre he had helped define. Directed by Sam Peckinpah, Ride the High Country cast Scott against type as a morally compromised former lawman, a radical departure from the straightforward heroes he had portrayed for decades. Perhaps this professional evolution had prompted a personal one as well. For whatever reason, when the interviewer casually mentioned Hayes among a list of Scott's notable co-stars, the actor's typically reserved demeanor softened visibly. After brief comments about Joel McCrea and other contemporaries, Scott paused thoughtfully when Hayes's name was mentioned. Then, to the interviewer's surprise, the normally reserved Scott spoke at length about his former sidekick. "Gabby was the genuine article," Scott was quoted as saying. "Behind all that beard and bluster was one of the finest actors I ever worked with. People don't realize that it takes extraordinary talent to create a character so memorable that it becomes part of the American landscape. That's what George did." The interviewer, Martin Hoffman, later described his astonishment at Scott's candor. "It was like watching a dam break. Here was Randolph Scott, famously tight-lipped about his personal relationships, suddenly opening up about Hayes with genuine emotion. I knew I was witnessing something rare and significant. Most surprisingly, Scott directly addressed rumors of their falling out. We had different views on where the industry was heading, that's true. But any tension between us has been greatly exaggerated. I've always respected his choices, even when they differed from mine. Looking back, I think he saw the future of entertainment more clearly than I did." Scott continued, offering unprecedented insight into their professional relationship. "George and I approached our work differently. I was always focused on the big picture, how each film fit into my overall career. George lived more in the moment, adapting to whatever came his way. In hindsight, his flexibility served him well as the industry changed." When asked why he had never spoken about Hayes publicly before, Scott's response was characteristically straightforward. "It wasn't anyone's business but ours. But now, with both of us in the twilight of our careers, it seems right to set the record straight." He added, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, "I'm not getting any younger, and neither is George." Some things shouldn't be left unsaid. The interview sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Here was Randolph Scott, long considered one of the industry's most private stars, not only acknowledging a long-rumored professional rift, but offering praise and even expressing a measure of regret about it. Hayes, who had largely retreated from public life following the end of his television show, was reportedly moved to tears when shown the article. According to his nephew, Hayes immediately placed a phone call to Scott, their first conversation in nearly a decade. Uncle George was genuinely touched, Edward Hayes later recalled. He'd always respected Randy enormously, even during their years of estrangement. To have that respect publicly acknowledged meant the world to him, especially coming from someone as reserved as Scott. What was said in that call remained private, but those close to both men noted a warming of relations in the months that followed. Hayes, now in his late 70s and facing health challenges, reportedly expressed his own regrets about how their professional relationship had ended. The reconciliation between the two aging Western icons became something of an open secret in Hollywood. Director Henry Hathaway, who had worked with both men, later commented, "It was good to see them patch things up. They were two of the best in the business, and neither had anything left to prove to anyone." When reporters pressed Hayes for his reaction to Scott's comments, the normally loquacious performer offered only a brief statement. "Randy always was a class act. Some things take time to work themselves out." Pressed for more details, Hayes simply added, "What matters is where you end up, not the detours you take along the way." Film historians would later point to Scott's candid interview as a pivotal moment in how Hollywood viewed its own history. By acknowledging both the creative differences and the mutual respect between himself and Hayes, Scott had humanized what had previously been industry gossip. It was remarkable for its time, noted film critic Leonard Maltin years later. Randolph Scott finally breaks silence on Gabby Hayes. They were the faces of America's golden age of westerns, one tall, stoic, and commanding, the other grizzled, animated, and unmistakable. For decades, Randolph Scott and George "Gabby" Hayes shared the silver screen, captivating audiences with their distinctive on-screen chemistry. But behind the dusty trails and shootouts, a story remained untold. What really happened between these two Western legends? What secrets lay buried beneath their professional partnership? And why did Randolph Scott wait until the twilight of his career to finally address the rumors that had followed them for decades? Stay with us as we uncover the remarkable story behind one of Hollywood's most enduring Western duos, a tale of friendship, rivalry, and reconciliation that changed the landscape of American cinema forever. Before we dive into the explosive revelations, it's worth understanding why this matters. In the pantheon of Western cinema, few pairings generated the box office magic of Scott and Hayes. Their collaborations represented the perfect balance of heroic gravitas and folksy comic relief that defined an era of American filmmaking. When Randolph Scott finally broke his silence about Gabby Hayes in that fateful 1962 interview, it wasn't just industry gossip. It was the closing chapter of Hollywood's Western Golden Age. Born into Southern gentility in Orange County, Virginia in 1898, Randolph Scott epitomized the strong, silent type long before he ever stepped in front of a camera. Raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a family of Scottish descent, young Randolph grew up with a distinctly genteel upbringing that contrasted sharply with his future on-screen persona. Tall, dignified, and well-educated, Scott served in World War I before finding his way to Hollywood in the late 1920s. Meanwhile, George Francis Hayes entered the world in 1885 in the tiny hamlet of Stannards, New York. Born in his father's hotel, Hayes was the third of 7 children in a family with modest means but abundant personality. Unlike the character he would later portray, the real George Hayes was articulate, intelligent, and immaculately groomed from an early age. Hayes first stepped onto a vaudeville stage at 17, running away from home to join a touring stock company. By 1914, he had married Olive Ireland, and the couple developed a successful vaudeville act that kept them comfortable until the 1929 stock market crash wiped out their savings. It was desperation, not design, that brought the 40-something Hayes to Hollywood. "I went there because I didn't have any money," he once admitted, "not because I wanted to be in pictures." A pivotal moment came in 1935 when Paramount cast Hayes as Windy Halliday, the bewhiskered sidekick to Hopalong Cassidy. The role required Hayes to transform his natural refinement into the grizzled, cantankerous persona that would define his career. The eccentric old-timer with catchphrases like "you're dern tootin'" and "dad gummit" was born, and American audiences couldn't get enough. Scott, meanwhile, had been building his own Western credentials. After appearing in several Zane Grey adaptations in the early 1930s, he established himself as a dependable leading man with the right combination of rugged good looks and understated authority. By the mid-1930s, Scott was beginning to narrow his focus to the Western genre that would eventually become his exclusive domain. The paths of Scott and Hayes would cross repeatedly throughout the late 1930s and 1940s, creating magic on screen that audiences flocked to theaters to witness. Their chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Scott's stoic heroism created the perfect canvas for Hayes's colorful character work. Together, they appeared in 6 films, including Trail Street, 1947, and The Caribou Trail, 1950. While this was fewer than Hayes's collaborations with other Western stars like John Wayne, 15 films, or Roy Rogers, 44 films, there was something distinctive about the Scott-Hayes dynamic that resonated with audiences. Behind the scenes, both men were forging important industry connections. Scott developed a particularly fruitful relationship with producer Harry Joe Brown, with whom he would later form the Randolph Production Company. These partnerships would prove crucial in the evolution of both men's careers. By the mid-1940s, both Scott and Hayes had achieved something remarkable in Hollywood. They had transcended being mere actors to become archetypes. When audiences thought of the Western hero, increasingly they pictured Randolph Scott's weathered face and ramrod posture. And no Western seemed complete without a character reminiscent of Gabby Hayes' colorful codger. But storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. In 1946, Hayes made a fateful decision that would alter the course of his career and ultimately strain his relationship with Scott. While Scott and Hayes maintained a professional rapport on set, insiders began noticing subtle tensions developing between the two Western icons around 1946. The exact nature of their disagreement remained private for decades, but several theories emerged to explain the growing distance. Hypothesis: A. The creative direction dispute. According to some industry insiders, the friction began over the direction of their collaborative projects. Hayes, despite his comic relief role, was reportedly pushing for more nuanced character development for his sidekick persona. Gabby was tired of just being the punchline, recalled one crew member who worked on Trail Street. He wanted his character to have more depth, more backstory, something beyond just saying, "Consarn it," every 5 minutes. Scott, however, reportedly believed in maintaining the clear distinction between lead and supporting roles. According to director Ray Enright, who worked with both men, Randy had very definite ideas about what worked in Westerns. He felt audiences expected certain things from each character, and he was reluctant to mess with that formula. This creative tension reportedly came to a head during the filming of Trail Street in 1947. While the cameras captured their usual easy chemistry, those on set described an increasingly strained relationship between takes. Hypothesis B. The career trajectory conflict. A competing explanation points to Hayes' decision to leave film entirely and pivot to television, a medium Scott reportedly dismissed as inferior to the cinematic experience. In 1950, after completing The Caribou Trail with Scott, Hayes made his final Western film appearance and transitioned to television with The Gabby Hayes Show on NBC. The program, which ran from 1950 to 1954, with a brief revival on ABC in 1956, featured Hayes introducing Western films and telling stories to a younger audience. According to this theory, Scott viewed Hayes' move to television as premature, and perhaps even a betrayal of their film partnership. Randolph was a purist, explained a former studio executive who knew both men. He saw TV as the enemy of cinema, especially Westerns. When Gabby embraced it so enthusiastically, I think Randy took it personally. Hayes reportedly defended his decision by pointing to changing audience tastes and the decline in B-Western production. "The writing's on the wall," he allegedly told Scott. "Television is where the audience is heading, and I'm not too proud to follow them there." Whatever the true source of their disagreement, one thing is certain. After the Caribou Trail in 1950, the two men never worked together again, and for over a decade, neither spoke publicly about their partnership or its dissolution. The cinema world was stunned in 1962 when Randolph Scott, promoting what would become his final film, Ride the High Country, granted a rare in-depth interview to Photoplay magazine. What began as a standard career retrospective took an unexpected turn when the interviewer asked about his former co-stars. After brief comments about Joel McCrea and other contemporaries, Scott paused thoughtfully when Hayes' name was mentioned. Then, to the interviewer's surprise, the normally reserved Scott spoke at length about his former sidekick. "Gabby was the genuine article," Scott was quoted as saying. "Behind all that beard and bluster was one of the finest actors I ever worked with. People don't realize that it takes extraordinary talent to create a character so memorable that it becomes part of the American landscape. That's what George did." Most surprisingly, Scott directly addressed rumors of their falling out. "We had different views on where the industry was heading, that's true. But any tension between us has been greatly exaggerated. I've always respected his choices even when they differed from mine. Looking back, I think he saw the future of entertainment more clearly than I did. When asked why he had never spoken about Hayes publicly before, Scott's response was characteristically straightforward. It wasn't anyone's business but ours. But now, with both of us in the twilight of our careers, it seems right to set the record straight. The interview sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Hayes, who had largely retreated from public life following the end of his television show, was reportedly moved to tears when shown the article. According to his nephew, Hayes immediately placed a phone call to Scott, their first conversation in nearly a decade. What was said in that call remained private, but those close to both men noted a warming of relations in the months that followed. When reporters pressed Hayes for his reaction to Scott's comments, the normally loquacious performer offered only a brief statement. Randy always was a class act. Some things take time to work themselves out. The fallout from Scott's revelations rippled through Hollywood. Former co-stars, directors, and studio executives weighed in, many expressing surprise that there had been any friction at all between the two Western icons. They always seemed like old friends on set, recalled director André de Toth. If there were problems, they never let it affect the work. For film historians, Scott's interview provided valuable insight into a transformative period in Hollywood, when the studio system was giving way to television and independent production. His acknowledgement that Hayes saw the future more clearly was viewed as a remarkably candid admission from a star not known for public introspection. Perhaps the most meaningful consequence came in the summer of 1963 when Scott made an unannounced appearance at a Western Film Festival in San Antonio where Hayes was being honored for his contributions to the genre. Attendees described an emotional moment when Scott walked on stage unannounced during Hayes' acceptance speech. The two men embraced to thunderous applause, effectively ending any speculation about lingering animosity. It was like watching the closing scene of a perfect Western, one witness later wrote, the kind where all conflicts are resolved and the sunset promises a better tomorrow. Their reconciliation proved timely. Hayes' health began to decline in the mid-1960s, and Scott reportedly made several private visits to his former co-star during this period. When Hayes passed away in February 1969 at age 83, Scott was among the pallbearers at his funeral, a final gesture of respect that spoke volumes about their restored friendship. Film critics and industry analysts subsequently reassessed the Scott-Hayes collaborations, noting how their different performance styles, Scott's understated dignity and Hayes' expressive character work, created a template that influenced countless Western films and television shows that followed. More than 5 decades after Scott broke his silence, the legacy of both men endures far beyond their personal relationship. Today, film scholars recognize Randolph Scott and Gabby Hayes as essential architects of the Western genre that helped define American cinema. Scott's later Westerns, particularly his collaborations with director Bud Boetticher, are now celebrated as sophisticated explorations of honor, vengeance, and the changing American West. Meanwhile, Hayes' influence can be seen in countless character actors who followed, from Walter Brennan to modern performers who recognize the essential balance a skilled sidekick brings to a Western narrative. Their films together, once considered simple entertainment, are now studied for their deceptive complexity and the subtle interplay between Scott's measured heroism and Hayes' earthy wisdom. The Caribou Trail, their final collaboration, is particularly prized by collectors for representing the culmination of their on-screen relationship. Both men have been honored with stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and annual festivals celebrate their contributions to film history. In Wellsville, New York, Hayes' hometown, Gabby Hayes Days were celebrated for years, while in Charlotte, North Carolina, a collection of Scott memorabilia attracts Western enthusiasts from across the country. Perhaps most telling is how their reconciliation has become nearly as legendary as their supposed feud. In an industry often defined by lasting grudges and unresolved conflicts, the Scott-Hayes story offers a different narrative, one where professional differences can be overcome and old friendships renewed. As Scott himself put it in one of his final interviews before his death in 1987, "In the end, what matters isn't the disagreements, but the work we did together. That's what lasts." When Randolph Scott finally broke his silence about Gabby Hayes, he did more than correct the historical record. He reminded us that behind the mythic figures of the silver screen were real people, complex, sometimes stubborn, but ultimately human. His candid reflections on their professional partnership, coming at the twilight of his own remarkable career, offered rare insight into a pivotal moment in entertainment history. It was a time when Hollywood was grappling with television's disruptive influence, when the Western genre was evolving from straightforward tales of heroes and villains into more nuanced explorations of the American character, and when actors were navigating unprecedented changes in how stories were told and consumed. Scott's interview was significant not just for what it revealed about his relationship with Hayes, notes film historian David Thompson, but for what it tells us about that crucial transitional period in Hollywood. It was the moment when the studio system was giving way to something new and uncertain. How performers responded to that uncertainty tells us much about both the industry and the individuals within it. The Scott-Hayes relationship, with its professional tensions and personal reconciliation, mirrors in many ways the very westerns they helped create. In the classic Western narrative, conflict ultimately gives way to resolution. Justice, however hard won, eventually prevails, and even bitter rivals can find common ground in the end. There's something quintessentially American about their story, observes cultural critic Neil Gabler. It's about second chances and redemption. It's about recognizing that differences in approach or philosophy don't have to result in permanent division. In that sense, it's a more optimistic narrative than many we see today. Their story reminds us that behind every on-screen partnership are human beings navigating not just their creative collaboration, but the larger currents of an industry and society in constant flux. That Scott and Hayes found their way back to mutual respect after years of estrangement speaks to the character of both men, and offers a template for how creative differences might be resolved with dignity and grace. Perhaps most importantly, their reconciliation ensured that the films they made together could be appreciated on their own merits, free from the shadow of personal conflict. The 6 westerns, starring Scott with Hayes as his sidekick, stand today as perfect time capsules of an American art form at its most accessible and entertaining. What makes their films together so enduringly watchable, suggests critic Matt Zoller Seitz, is the perfect balance they achieved between Scott's moral gravity and Hayes's earthy humor. Neither overwhelms the other. They exist in perfect equilibrium. That's rare in any creative partnership. In a 1966 interview, 3 years after their public reconciliation, Hayes offered perhaps the most insightful comment on their professional relationship. "Randy and I were like different instruments in the same orchestra. He was the shallow, deep, resonant, carrying the melody. I was more like the piccolo, adding color, punctuation, personality. Neither makes much sense without the other in the context of the full composition." So the next time you watch Randolph Scott ride tall in the saddle with Gabby Hayes by his side, remember that you're witnessing more than just a Hollywood partnership. You're seeing a relationship that withstood the test of time, overcame personal differences, and ultimately reinforced what made their westerns so enduring: the triumph of character over conflict. Their films together, Badlands of Dakota, Trail Street, or Return of the Bad Men, The Caribou Trail, and others, continue to entertain new generations of viewers. More importantly, they preserve a moment in American cultural history when the Western was the nation's dominant form of myth-making, and when 2 very different performers found common ground in bringing that mythology to life. In the final analysis, wrote film critic Roger Ebert in a 1997 reassessment of Scott's career, "What makes the Scott-Hayes films so valuable isn't just their entertainment value, though that remains considerable. It's how they capture a particular moment in our cultural evolution, when Americans were still largely unified in their understanding of heroes and villains, right and wrong, civilization and wilderness. Scott and Hayes helped articulate that shared understanding, that their personal story eventually mirrored the reconciliation found in their best films only adds to their legacy. As we navigate our own era of media disruption and cultural division, the story of Randolph Scott finally breaking his silence about Gabby Hayes offers more than just Hollywood history. It provides a reminder that creative differences need not lead to permanent estrangement, that professional rivalries can eventually give way to mutual appreciation, and that sometimes the most meaningful resolutions come not in the heat of conflict, but in the quiet wisdom of later years. In that sense, their story embodies the very best of the Western tradition they helped create, where justice, however delayed, eventually arrives, where character ultimately matters more than conflict, and where even the longest trail leads at last to home. If you enjoyed this look into one of Hollywood's great partnerships, be sure to like and subscribe for more explorations of the stories behind the silver screen. And share in the comments your favorite Scott and Hayes film. We'd love to know which of their collaborations means the most to you.